Welcome to episode 260, When Sessions Go Sideways, Catching Resistance Early Using Process Coding, featuring Dr. Jordan Harris, licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am nerding out as I do. Really excited for this conversation with Dr. Jordan Harris. Dr. Harris is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a licensed professional counselor and supervisor in both of those domains, and has come here today to talk with us about the concept of resistance, which I think is sometimes just hard for us to even define, but then also how we can get better at recognizing it in therapy and therefore better at responding to it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Harris.
Thank you for having me, Beth.
So for our listeners, please take a moment and tell us about yourself and how this came to be one of your clinical specialties.
Yeah. So my name is Dr. Harris. Most of my colleagues just call me Jordan. And I basically, honestly, I wanted to be a really good therapist. I wanted to really help people. And I really, really, really wanted that. The problem was that I was really bad as a therapist. I was really bad. I almost didn't graduate from my grad program because I couldn't keep clients. You have the university clinic and people come in and you got to get so many hours, and I was just really bad at it. And it didn't make sense to me because I was also a nerd and I read all the books and I was like, I know the theory, what's going on. So that sent me on this journey for about the next decade to figure out how do you get good at this thing. And I stumbled into the research on deliberate practice, feedback-informed treatment. I got to talk with some luminaries in the field like Scott Miller, Tony Ruminier, Alex Vosh, and they just really lit up for me what it meant to be a therapist and really showed me, okay, this is what you have to do. And at one point, back in 2023, I was working with Alex Vosh, and Alex is co-author on probably at least a dozen, if not more, books on expertise, deliberate practice, and counseling. And so I hired him as my private coach, which was a sacrifice. I was fortunate enough to be able to make. And he said, I'm not coaching anymore. I'm going to go start a university, so I can't be your coach anymore. And I said, dag nabbit. And he said, but I read this article and you should read it. And it was called Developing Expertise in Psychotherapy, the Case for Process Coding as Clinical Training, written by two researchers up in Canada, Henny Westra and Alyssa DiBartolomeo. And I read the article, was blown away. And what the basic idea of the article is feedback-informed treatment works. It's brilliant. It's so good. The problem is that it's kind of slow, right? And there's different feedback-informed systems, right? Which you take sort of the classic Scott Miller system. You have the session rating scale, which you give at the end of the session. The client rates themselves on the scale. You wait a week. They come back in a week later. You're reviewing it, and you try to make adjustments. And what they said in this article was that feedback loop of a week is kind of slow. And then they made a leap, which I think is one of the great leaps of history, right? Where they said, in our research, we've had to learn process coding, which is basically a form of reading clients. And because of that, we are able to get feedback much faster on how we're doing with our clients, right? So instead of waiting a week to get feedback, we can see real time, moment to moment, what's happening. And our feedback loops are much smaller. And we think that this is because of our training and learning to process code. And so we think that this is the way to develop expertise as a counselor. I then talked to my wife and said, hey, I really want to spend the money. She was like, I love you. And I was like, thank you. And I spent the money and hired Alyssa as my coach for most of 2024. And basically every week she just blew up my brain and taught me things I'd never learned before and really brought a lot of clarity. Um, and so that's how I got into it. And that's also, why I think this is so important, because I think it really demystifies a lot of what happens in the room.
I love that, and I'm stoked for this conversation. Our listeners have probably figured out by this point, that I'm such a big fan of deliberate practice and feedback informed treatment. And you're absolutely right about that potential break between something happening and then actually being able to address it or work through it, and also kind of how unnatural that can feel in or any relationship, to like basically hold this person said something the last time we got together, when we got dinner, and I don't know if I want to bring it up the next time I see them, and maybe I'll just let it go. And then you realize the potential for that to be happening in therapy. And then the pressure that a client might be holding for that next session. That's something that I've witnessed, and experienced as a fit therapist and fit trainer. So I'm excited to hear these perspectives, because this stuff comes at you fast. Like, that's one of the things that I think has always kind of stunned me, is the delicacy of human interaction. Like, it happens so darn fast, and we glance away for half a second too long, and it makes someone else's amygdala go, "What's going on?" And I think it's why these conversations are so important, where it's like, how do we kind of stay in the moment with this very rapid process of human interaction? So, Jordan, as we dive into this topic, we've had the pleasure on Clearly Clinical's podcast previously to talk about process coding, but can you kind of give us a quick 101 for folks who aren't familiar with it and kind of the concepts behind it? And then we'll dive in more to resistance and how all of this kind of plays out real time.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you my definition, and then I'm going to give you like the academic definition. And my definition is a story. So last Christmas, my wife's side of the family, they do Christmas stockings. And so everyone brings a little something to put in everyone's stocking. And I decided to make my mom's famous chocolate chip cookies. So I made her cookies and put them in little bags. And the recipe calls for using a ice cream scoop, which is kind of big. So I made them smaller, and I put them in bags, and I put them in stockings. And I was talking to my sister-in-law about it. And I said, I don't quite get it. Like, the cookies, they're a little bit burnt. And she was like, well, I know what you did wrong. And if you're listening to this and you bake, like, you already know what I did wrong. You already know. I had no idea. She said, you changed the size of the cookies. So now they're going to cook faster. So I was like, obviously, that's so, like, as soon as you said it, it was so obvious. So I went home and I had some extra dough, pulled it out of the freezer, put it in the oven for less time, because I'm smart, and pulled them out, and they were doughy. And if you're a baker, you already know what I did wrong, but I had no idea. And I was talking to my wife, and she said, well, yeah, you pulled the dough out of the freezer. It's still cold. And process and therapy are all the other dynamics that happen in a session that aren't necessarily related to the model, right? So if the model is the recipe, sugar, butter, flour, 350 for 12 minutes, like, that's the recipe, right? Process is how we do it. What's the size of the cookie? What's the temperature of the dough? And process coding is learning to really see the different parts of that so you can make the recipe work, right? So my sister-in-law was able to code immediately, right? Identify immediately the size. She's coding the cookies on size. My wife was immediately able to code the cookies on temperature, right? And the same thing happens in therapy, right? You're following your model. You're doing trauma-focused CBT, right? And like a lot of models, has great outcomes. But sometimes it works better than other times. And what's the difference? Process researchers would say that there's any number of different processes that we may or may not be attending to better or worse that are dictating the outcome, right? So in the same way that I'm following the same recipe, right, but I'm getting a slightly different outcome, when you're working with a client and maybe you're not quite attuned to their level of motivation, right? or you're not quite attuned to cultural dynamics, right? The outcome is going to be is going to be different. So that's sort of like the definition that I use. And then researchers would basically say that it's tracking the moment-to-moment interaction between client and therapist, right? So
The idea of coding is not new in the therapy world. Like there are different models have been doing this for decades. Not necessarily as much focused on that real-time dynamic between client and therapist. Like a lot of times we're kind of like coding just the client, or we're coding, like if I'm pulling from the Gottman method, we're coding interactions that are happening between a dyad and our observation of them. And this idea of process coding and doing it real time, it's a necessary one in the sense that it categorically validates what therapists are doing. I think many of us have felt that sensation of imposter syndrome and like, what am I doing? What am I supposed to do next? And knowing that something is off, and then especially when you're noobing, like I have no idea how to get it back on again, and hoping for the best, and misstepping, like inevitably. And what I've learned about process coding over the years is kind of this, and I would love for you to refine or completely reject this analogy, but how it feels for me, older reference, in the movie Ghost, when Patrick Swayze is kind of like rising up out of his body and he's like watching himself and things that are happening, but is also like in his body kind of simultaneously. That's how I kind of see process coding. Do you agree with that analogy?
great question. I mean, for you, when you have that experience, right, this sort of double vision of being in the moment and also observing the moment, do you feel disconnected from your clients?
At this point for me, generally no. However, I can say earlier in my career, yes, because it felt like I was observing myself more than I was being in myself, if that makes sense. And then like really wanting to wish that I had one of those gadgets that you see in different sci-fi movies where you're like, pause, and you just like stop the person and what they're saying or listening to you. And then you're like, let me think about all of these things and all of, the history and like the thing that happened last week with the partner and blah, blah, blah. And then like, let me come up and construct like the perfect response. And then you're like, and play. So I think I would like to believe I'm probably more integrated with it now, but particularly earlier in my career, feeling separate from when I was stuck.
So when I worked with Alyssa last year, we both had that same experience, that it actually sort of gives you this meta awareness of what's happening. For both of us, though, we did not feel like it took us out of the moment. And my experience of Alyssa was it was very meta because she was always doing what she was preaching, basically, right? So even when I would have an issue with something she said, the way she would respond to me was to diffuse the resistance. I mean, it was always happening, and I felt like she was one of the warmest people I've ever met. And so I think that you're right, that it does sort of give you this meta awareness. And I think something that we don't know is, do you have to have the first part where you feel sort of disconnected? My hunch is, because I've since gone on to learn 4 other different coding systems, is that once you have the ability to see, it's automatically there. And so my hunch is that the early part of what you experience has more to do with how we train than process coding itself.
Yeah, at least for like my experience, I agree with that. And we're getting heady just in this conversation, like surprise, surprise. But thinking about it from like a fit stance, for example, for me, one of the epiphanies that accompanied me around motivational interviewing, around dialectical behavior therapy, around feedback informed treatment was recognizing inherently what we're talking about is like kind of the spirit. Like we're talking about a way of being, and that how I think of it is like kind of once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that I think is probably this is meta again, but like I think that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about process coding. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. When you start to recognize these, the way the ping pong ball is going back and forth across the table, and then it becomes more of an ingrained part of the work. At least it has for me. You know, I can't speak for anybody else. I'd love your feedback on it. But for me, it's become an ingrained part of the work when I start to feel kind of that tension of like, I misstepped, my statement there was wrong, or my interpretation was wrong, or whatever it is. Like, I think I feel it and lean into that resistance much more. When I was younger, it was like, I'm going to lean out. This is uncomfortable, and like kind of pretend it didn't happen. So now it's like a spirit, a way of being.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this gets into something that for me is sort of metaphysical, but I think all of this is a way for us to grow as people. You know, like I think all of these activities and areas these arenas that we play in, they're not just the arena; they're also the area which, I mean, therapy is practice for me to be a better husband, for me to be a better dad, honestly. So I agree with you, right? Of like, once you see it, it changes you as a person, hopefully for the better, so you can show up in your life in better ways. Absolutely. But it also means then that you can't unsee it. You can't go back.
Yeah, and I can't imagine going back, and I don't want to go back. And I think any supervisor will say, when you have worked with therapists who are working on developing their self in the room, and then you see like this epiphany where it like suddenly gels, and it's like, oh, just so beautiful, like that energy. So like for our listeners that are like, what is this process coding stuff that they're talking about? I think my perspective on it is it's taking those concepts to the next level to make them much more concrete and easier to identify, so that then we can map interactions and directions.
I mean, I think you're totally right. And let's bridge this back to something that many people already do, right? Because what's funny to me is somehow in academia, we take the most obvious things and make them so confusing and abstract.
Yes.
Right? So I'll give you a very simple example, right? Like, I have kids, right? And I know how bedtime is going to go pretty early on because I can code it.
Yeah.
Right? When my 3-year-old asks me at the dinner table, who's putting me down tonight? Right? I can code him, I can read him, and I know if he's going to want mom or dad. And I know that if it's not the person who he wants, he's going to be upset. Right? When my 5-year-old has trouble with his math homework, right? I know, I can just look at him and tell if he's going to stick it out or if he needs me to say, hey, let's take a break. You know, how do I know this? And I think, you know, traditionally people say things like, oh, I just know, right? And you do. But the question is, what are you seeing? Because once you can name what you're seeing, then you can teach it to other people, and they can do the same thing that you can do, right? Which is really what we want. I want my kids' aunts and uncles to be just as attuned to them as I am. But if I say, well, I just see it, I just know it, that doesn't help them. But if I say, look, my 3-year-old, you should say first, guess what? I'm putting you down tonight. But if he asks, you're sort of already in the spot where it's not going to go well, right? And when my 5-year-old is like looking at his math and starts to like scrunch his brow, he does this little scrunch here. That's the thing. That's the sign that, okay, let's take a break, get some water, get a snack, And so process coding really is about naming those little things that you sort of know intuitively in the back of your mind, naming them explicitly so that they can be replicated.
I love that. And I love that example. I think that's really illustrative and absolutely accurate, at least around my house and bedtime. Because you're right. Like we're taking in an extraordinary amount of information every single second. And we are actually making decisions based on that information, but it often happens so fast that we think it's just kind of this magical thing, but it actually can be broken down. And I've loved that about like couples work too, where it's like, well, let's go back and rewind this moment and figure out, where did you lose her? When did it happen? And it's like, oh, well, when she shifted her seat and looked away. And I'm like, whoa, look at that. Like, it's a little moment. There it was. So hopefully that's helpful for our listeners in kind of understanding this idea of process coding. The next part of this, I'm stoked on because this is like a pretty, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but complicated concept. Thinking about resistance. And absolutely, many of us were trained, or at least it was brought up, this perspective of like, if a client is resistant, then they're just not ready. They're just not ready for change. They're just not ready for the work. And then you could kind of be like, okay, well, like maybe in a year, next. And then you meet the newer age models of therapy that went, hold up, how convenient. Like, kind of how convenient that we can be like, yeah, I had nothing to do with that. That's all you client are bringing in resistance, and you need to deal with that before you're going to come back to me. So then you have a whole different perspective. Can you break down some of that and give us your feedback about resistance and kind of a working definition? Because I think it's hard sometimes to define it, especially when different parts of the field in different parts of history have seen this concept very differently.
I mean, let me first say that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of processes in counseling, right? So there's client experiencing, right? There's persuasion, there's motivation, right? John Gottman, I mean, I think my riff on John Gottman is that he's massively misunderstood, that his innovation is not the couples therapy. His innovation is that he showed us, one, that you could literally code and break down couples conflict. Like, and he sort of like couches it in this therapy model, but he's really a process coder, right? I mean, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are the four codes in his coding manual that predict early relationship disillusion, right? At about 6.9 years. That's what his real innovation is. And I think it's like freaking amazing. So there are all these different processes. And one of the ones, and you know, Henny and Alyssa, they basically say that we should start with an understanding of resistance in counseling, because how we handle resistance has an outsized impact, especially negatively, on counseling up to a year later, right? So it's not always that we can make things better, but it is that we can make things worse. So then the question is, what is resistance? And in the research that they've done, they define resistance as any opposition to the therapist or the therapy. Now, you're 100% right. I say that, and people typically people who come to my trainings, they say, "Okay, yeah," and then we watch tape, and they go, "That's not resistance. The client wants to change." And what typically happens is we have a bunch of different other ideas that come into this sort of space, right? So if I say resistance, I'm sure there's a dozen listeners who are going to say, "Well, resistance doesn't exist," right? And then there's people on the other side who are all going to say, "Well, my client is not a bad client; they're a good person," right? And other people are going to say, "Man, look, there's too much pressure on therapists to get things right." And my response is, this is an academic definition, right? And so, absolutely, I'm not saying that simply because a client demonstrates resistance per this definition, that they're a bad person or you're a bad therapist, right? And I'm not saying that they don't want to change. Those things, that's, you know, from an academic standpoint, those things are sort of outside the definition. The definition is anytime a client says, that doesn't work for me. And the way I talk about it is resistance is therapy mold. I watch a lot of tapes. I've seen brilliant therapists just be trucking along, doing brilliant work, and they hit resistance. And it's not because they've done anything wrong. It just happens in conversation. So in the same way that, you know, if you have a bathroom and you're using it to bathe yourself, at some point it's going to get moldy and you're going to need to clean out the tub or replace the shower. Resistance is the exact same way. No one's done anything wrong. It just happens in human interaction. And what's important is when you see it, can you treat it? Because if not, it will grow and become malignant.
What is the function of resistance?
Different functions, right? Oh, yeah, totally different functions. Sometimes clients are resistant because of preconceived notions. I've seen there's this one old tape of a client coming in, mandated for, he got a DUI, and he says to the therapist, "I don't like blondes. My caseworker is a blonde, and I don't like you." right? So totally preconceived notions from a negative experience with a caseworker, right? Sometimes it's this way of getting there. I don't want to do that way, right? And so you say to a client, hey, like, how about we do some EMDR sets? And they go, I don't know. Like, it's kind of weird, right? They're not saying that they don't want to change. They're saying that this way of getting there is not the path for them. So it really just depends. What's most important, though, is how we respond. Because, I mean, the research that Alyssa and Henny have done has basically shown that if we misrespond in those moments, it has a negative impact on therapy. So their big thing is timing. That a sense of resistance gives you a sense of timing. When to do what.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about when to do what. Because like really, when you're talking about a clinician struggling in a session for the entire session for 1 minute, I think what we're really talking about is like, what do I do now?
I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. So in order to teach me about resistance, Alyssa sat me down and she showed me the MISC, which is the motivational interviewing. I can't remember the whole name of it, but it's their coding manual. And she basically said there are 3 types of statements clients often make, right? So if you have a client who's struggling with anxiety, they might say something like, man, I have a big presentation at work and I really want to do well. And that is a statement for change, right? They might also say, I've always been anxious. My parents were anxious. It's just sort of like in my DNA. And that's a statement basically saying that they can't change, that it's going to be hard for them to change, right? And so that's a statement for like sustain. Sometimes, though, very often, clients do both. They give statements for change, and then they immediately follow it up with statements for staying the same, right? I'm here because I have a big presentation at work, and I'm really anxious, and I need to do well, but I don't know if I can change. My family's always been anxious, right? Or they'll say something like, I mean, my doctor says, and I agree, that all this anxiety is like really contributing to my bowel issues, IBS, Crohn's, functional disorders. Like, I don't know what it is, but I'm pretty sure that that's the issue. So I need to deal with this. But you know what? Like, I also kind of feel like that means that the problem is me and I'm broken. And so I really struggle coming in here to therapy today, right? They're saying both, right? This is what they quote as ambivalence. And then the last one is resistance, right? If a client actually pushes back against the thing that you're offering. So why do I say this as the answer to your question? Because one of the big light bulb moments that I had was the client's level of change dictates what you do next, right? So if they're just giving you lots of action type statements, right? I'm nervous about work, but I got to do better. I really want to get this thing resolved. Then you move right into your intervention, right? Let's do breathing. Let's do body work. Let's do EMDR. Let's like whatever it is that you do. You just do your thing. If they're on the other side of this thing, right, where they aren't just being ambivalent and they're not just giving you sustained talk and they're also giving you resistance. Look, you're blonde. I don't know if I want to be here. Then the big goal for you is just to defuse the resistance. And so for me, it's like, oh, wait, moment to moment, you know what to do next. If you're in the resistance, you diffuse the resistance. If you're on the other side and they're saying, I'm ready, give me the tool, the skill, the intervention, you just give them the tool, the skill, the intervention. And if they're in the middle, then you sort of test things out, right? If they're sort of ambivalent, maybe you help them clarify, right? You reflect both sides of that. And if there's like straight sustained talk, you can get a different goal. Okay, so look, this thing is not right for you. Let's pick something else. What is right for you?
I'm imagining you in session and effectively seeing this color changing light over a client's head.
Exactly.
And you're like, green, 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 no, it's starting to shift to yellow, we're getting to orange. And like, then that's your indicator versus like I've tried therapy before. This is never going to work, which is like flashing red. But this kind of moment to moment metric that is, I'm thinking about like the integration of heart rate into like the Gottman method, where it's like these real time measures to help us understand what's happening. But really, I love your example about like bedtime, because like we know these moments very well. Like we've all been there when we're like, yeah, and then like, did you see that speech? Am I right? And then you're like, they had a different reaction to speech than I did. Like it's like there's this instantaneous thing, and you're like, nope, we are not on the same page, and it's like red light. And that without going too far off of this topic, that's where we get into trouble. It's like when we exist in therapy land and leave the reds as reds. And that's where we lose clients, where they're less likely to achieve their goals, where they drop out prematurely, where they don't come back ever to any therapist. And for our listeners, I nerd out on this stuff, but please take a listen to some of those other episodes with Dr. Miller, with Dr. Chow, kind of talking about these concepts of like the impact. But here we are in this moment here with Dr. Harris talking about like, here is that moment. And I want to zoom in there. Jordan was kind enough to bring some resources that we're going to use together in talking about different vignettes and the way that therapists are making deductions and decisions about what to do next, and where we are or are not very good at assessing readiness for change, at assessing resistance. So I'll let you kind of take it from there, Jordan, and introduce this.
Yeah. So my researcher friends, they developed two tools to test and train therapists in seeing resistance and then responding to resistance. So these vignettes are going to be pulled right from those tools. And they're up on my site. If people want to take them for themselves, they can take them and see how they score as well. So let's go through a few of these. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the client statement. So I'm going to set the tone, read the client statement. And the first thing we're going to talk through is this statement resistance or not, right? So one of the vignettes is a mom coming in, struggling with substance use. And in the clip, the mom says, I have 2 little kids. And the therapist and the mom have been talking about ways that the mom can like maybe not be using substances or that sort of stuff, right? And the mom says, I have 2 little kids and I've been using in one form or another their whole lives. So I don't know if they're aware of it. I don't include them in my drug deals or take them with me to pick up drugs. So the first question I think to ask yourself, and I would encourage anyone listening to this to just take a second and think to themselves, is this statement resistance? And then the second thing I would ask is this person pushing against the direction set by the therapist or the therapy itself? Often those are different answers, right? And I think those answers are different because we think resistance is one thing, but the definition is this person pushing it away from the therapy or the therapist?
Yeah, the institution or the individual in front of you.
Right. So we talked about this one early on, so you sort of know the answer, but what do you think most students would say, the average therapist would say? Is this statement resistance, or do you think they would say that it's not resistance?
Probably that it's not resistance. And if anything, it's like a little ambivalence. But that I think many clinicians would hear that and not reach immediately for resistance. I think we'd probably reach for this is like my MI clicking in, but we would reach for some motivational factors, and I would grab some not resistance. I'd grab some ambivalence from that about the like I don't know if they're aware of it. It's been going on their whole lives, and so like kind of that statement, for lack of a better term, kind of like taking a nap in the comfort of like, well, they probably wouldn't know any different anyway. Like so, then it's like there's my little ambivalent spot where I'm going to back myself into. How do you hear it?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're totally right. Most people, right, reading this are going to say, maybe not most, but a lot of people would say, this is not resistance. The person is saying that I don't know. And I think the question is, what's the function of this statement, right? Like, we've been talking, Beth, about this as third parties. But if we're in session, right, and I'm your client, and you just said to me, I mean, do you think your kids know about you using? Like, I'm going to be defensive. I'm probably going to feel like you're sort of attacking me. There's also some social norms, right, of how I respond to people in a professional setting. So I'm not going to say, look, stop being mean and calling me a bad mom. I'm going to say, well, I mean, I don't know if they really know that I'm using drugs, but I'm subtly rejecting the idea that this is a problem, or at least that they're implicated in it. So what's the function of it? And you brought up MI. MI has this really beautiful distinction between simple reflections and complex reflections, right? And simple reflections are when you just basically repeat back to people what they already said. And a complex reflection is when you read into the underlying meaning and give that back to them. And what we're helping people to do in this process coding training is, okay, do the same thing. Like, what's the underlying message here? And the underlying message is the person is saying, this is not a problem. And they're saying that in opposition to you, therapist. So this is resistance.
So you're in session, and somehow we landed at this client making this statement. And effectively, kind of the subtext that I'm getting from the statement is, I don't know about that.
Exactly.
So if the concept is, my kids are harmed by my substance use, like that is like the statement, the implication. And then I, as a client, am like, I don't know about that. I've kind of already made myself a way to reject that notion in that statement, because I've said I've been using in one form or another their whole lives, kind of like this is nothing new and they're fine. I mean, to me, it actually kind of reminds me of that statement of like, well, I turned out okay, like, where it's like there is this implication of, I don't know about that. And that's where you're hearing the resistance. Tell me more about coding different responses. And like you already kind of alluded to it in talking about MI and for listeners, motivational interviewing. So what I'm hearing in this is kind of this motivational interviewing piece, the MI piece of like these deepening questions in almost like this menu of options of like how we're going to respond. So client makes X statement and we have this indicator light that's showing us now we've moved from green, we're on the same page, to some kind of leaning away into like yellow, into orange, into red. Tell me about the coding and kind of the menu and what is leaving the therapy stagnant, or what's moving it further along on the goal path or setting us back.
Totally. Yeah. So when it comes to the process of resistance, they basically have 3 boxes, right? And this comes right out of the coding manual. So all of these assessments have coding manuals. And the 3 boxes are being directive. There's like a null box, right? And then there's basically being supportive. And so in the research, they've basically seen that if you respond with some version of support, the most evidence-based response of which is a reflection, it tends to defuse the resistance. But you can do reflection, validation, normalization, affirmation, sometimes collaborative problem solving, right? These things all tend to reduce the resistance. And the null box are usually questions, and the questions are basically some sort of tell me more question, right? Which I think is really counterintuitive to a lot of therapists, right? A lot of us think, oh, wait, like, tell me more actually diffuses hard moments. And that tends to not be the case, right? It's more of the reflections and the affirmations that will do that. And then in the box of things that tend to make resistance grow, it's being directive type statements, right? So being judgmental, cheerleading, shaping or reframing people's statements, focus on resolving the issue. Right? Any statements that sort of do this, they tend to make the resistance grow. Now, that doesn't mean that those are bad things to do, right? It's just about timing. So if you're in the red, that is not the moment to be cheerleading. But if you're in the green and your client does this really big thing and they're really excited about it, then yeah, you cheerlead, right? But the timing matters. The timing matters.
So let's go back to this vignette. I've been doing it for so long, I'm not even sure my kids notice.
So let's say that you respond and you say something like, it sounds like you have identified some of the things you do to protect your kids from your use. Are there any costs or consequences that have affected your kids as a result of your use. So in my part of the field, we would code this as likely to increase the resistance because there's this subtle push from the therapist to have the client change, right? Are you aware of the costs? You're sort of implying that you're implying that there are costs and that something about how they are needs to be different.
It feels kind of political because there was the actual content of what was said. And then when the therapist says, it sounds like you identified some things you do to protect your kids from your use. But that's literally not what the client said. And so it is like they handed us some ingredients and then we put those ingredients together, but then we kind of added some stuff and we're like this. And it's like, no, it doesn't taste right. It's like, I guess like how it's landing to me, because it's like, no, you added salt. And to me, I could see the potential for a miss where then the client's like, that's not what I just said. So then you have the therapist saying, tell me about the costs and consequences when the client's already said, I don't think there necessarily are any. And so you're just kind of like inadvertently discounting what the client has already told you and just saying, I reject that. I reject your assertion. You're wrong. Your assessment about this, clearly there's been an impact on your kid. So tell me about those costs. And I can see the potential for the client to, I guess, like kind of feel confused.
I mean, I think confused. I think also misunderstood. And also kind of like you think that they're dumb.
Exactly. Where it's like, I basically told you what I think about this. And then you interpreted it through your interpretation machine and fed me back something that's different than what I just gave you. And
right. Yeah, right. Exactly. I don't think you're listening.
And we've all
to
been
me.
there, right? Like we've totally all been there. And I hate that feeling. Like I hate that feeling. I think most of us do.
I mean, Beth, you're hitting on something that I think is so important, right? This goes back to this weird divide between therapy and real life. We've all been to the doctor and I'll use the dentist and they say some version of, you really need to start flossing. And you're like, well, yeah, doctor, I know I need to floss my teeth, right? That's what you sort of think. But you know what? At nighttime, I'm exhausted, had a full day. And so I forget about it every night. And so you say, well, yeah, I just don't know when I would do that. And the dentist is like, what do you mean you don't know when you would do it? You do it at nighttime, right? And how do you feel on the other side of that? You're like, it's not that easy. You're not listening to me. Like we all know that feeling. But then when we become the therapist, we like totally forget that sometimes. And I mean that as myself as well, right? Is that we're like, I mean, clearly you just flossed your teeth. You know what I mean? It's like, well, yeah, but remember how it is on the other side.
So if our goal is to bring this back to neutral, at the very least, null, or ideally move it forward, so that was one example of not great, probably just increased resistance. Give me another example of a statement or question that might increase resistance. And let's talk about then like kind of bringing that pendulum and swinging it the other way into either neutral or actually moving it forward.
Okay. So you want another one that would increase the resistance.
To the same person that's saying, I don't know if my kids even know. They don't know any different.
So here's one. You have standards for what is and isn't okay, but you're also not quite sure if they're fully processing what is going on. So in this one, there's this implication that it is having a negative effect, but you're not quite sure if they're processing or if it's having an effect. But it's having an effect. Like we all sort of know that.
So it's still putting the therapist in a position of knowing better than the client.
Yes, exactly. Which again, and this for me was maybe my own big rub, because I've worked addiction treatment and I'm like, but sometimes like kids are in danger and this needs to change. So we're not saying that that's not true, right? That is true oftentimes. Oftentimes therapists have a really good intuition about, oh, wait, right? Like this is problematic. But again, it goes back to the timing of in this moment, this is not the time to be like, hey, look, mom, this is a big problem. This is when you need to change. No.
Well, I think that goes back to the kind of fundamentals of therapy of like, what are we here for? And the way that motivational interviewing has been integrated in medical care, for example, where it's like, okay, you've had multiple heart incidents and it looks like part of this is dietary. We know from the research, if a doctor says, well, you just need to eat fewer burgers and less red meat and that the patient is much less likely to do it. And so it's like, well, what are we here for? To actually work toward a change that is improving the quality of life for the client? Or are we working toward just kind of like us being right? Because then it's like, really, it's not, is the doctor right that we need to floss more and we need to eat red meat? Yes, absolutely, the doctor's right. But if I almost inherently reject that message and the change doesn't happen to move me toward better health, then what was the point other than me feeling good about my rightness? And then kind of the concepts of power over, and it's really interesting when you kind of deconstruct what are we actually trying to accomplish here. And all of us, human beings and clinicians, do that, where we can go power over, where how can you not see? And at least for me, that's like the giant red flag for me when I have that, like, here we go again. And then I'm like, woo, I have some stuff I need to work through and get some supervision and talk this one out. But so I can hear in these kind of negative examples that are potentially increasing resistance, there's still the sense of, hey, client, you don't understand.
Yes. Oftentimes, yes.
So tell me about null.
So null will be something like, there's two different versions of null. One is like a purely sort of coding version of null. So if you get an odd response that you just don't know what to do with, you call that as null. But also, if you ask some version of, tell me more, right? So your kids, they don't know about your drug use, tell me more about that. That could go either way, right? Or it could go to no way. That could increase, it could decrease, it could also maybe not. Like, it's just sort of a throwaway, almost, in a way.
I'm also hearing like the delivery on that line would dramatically change how it's landing for a client. So if you're like, so it sounds like your substance use hasn't really impacted your kids that much. Like, that sounds really neutral. But if you're like, oh, so you're saying, and it suddenly has this like snarky edge to it where it's like, watch that light go red. Right. So it's like, I think there's also the complexity of like, not just the words that are being used, but the delivery and the authenticity or like lack thereof. It's just, these are interesting concepts to kind of play with, because like I've been in interactions where I think most of us have, where like somebody says the exact right words, but it doesn't land, where they're like, yeah, I'm happy to pick your daughter up. And you're like, your words are saying one thing, but some reason I have the sense that you mean something else. So just interesting things to think about in like this idea of coding of like, this is actually more than just the words that are being said. Moving into the gold stars, what are some of the things that would theoretically take this yellowish red or yellowish orange statement and diffuse resistance and help us get back onto like working together?
So let's even go a step below that, right? Let's not go for the gold star. Let's just go for a decent response. And the low-hanging, easy thing to do is to offer any sort of reflection. So for you, what would you reflect out of this, right? Client says, I have 2 kids. I've been using it in one form or another their whole lives. So I don't know if they're aware of it. I don't include them in my drug deals or take them with me to go pick up drugs. And you're going to give a very simple, basic reflection.
This is something that's been going on for your kids for a long time, and you don't know what or if any impact it's had.
For me, it's really important to just highlight this, because one of the things that Alyssa really taught me was it doesn't have to be fancy. A simple reflection oftentimes goes a long way. Now, of course, I think you're right. How you say it also has an impact on it. And that gets into the process of persuasion, which is a different process, right? Which I think is also really fascinating. And I work with people in that as well. But if you stick with this, literally just having a very simple reflection like that. You could even make it more simple. You don't include them when you go. That's likely to decrease the resistance. Now, for the gold stars, right? A gold star, you basically want to include 2 or more elements, right? So you might do something like a reflection and a normalization. You don't include them when you go. And many moms think, really hard about how to take care of their kids. So totally, it makes sense that you do that, right? Maybe you do a validation and a reflection, right? Wow, I see how important your kids are to you. That's beautiful. And so, yeah, you don't take them when you go to pick up drugs, right? So that would be like a gold star sort of response, according to the coding manual.
If we really boiled it down, then what you're talking about is either this person gets me or they understand what I'm saying, which those are two different concepts. But we haven't talked about it in this interview, and I also think it's been implied. This is about client autonomy and the right for somebody to have beliefs, values, actions different than the ones that we would take, and for them to still be valid. And in those kind of gold star statements, what I'm hearing there is like, I see you. I see what you're doing, human being in front of me.
Totally. You got it. You got it.
If we had time today, I would totally go deeper here into like let's break this down and look into the what separates like a single gold star from 3 gold stars in those statements, because like I remember my first MI training and being like, whoa, like a complex reflection and like kind of stacked responses and how you're positioning this, and like it's just fascinating stuff for anybody listening who hasn't looked into MI. It's like kind of change magic, that it's like, whoa, humans are weird. When you position information in a certain order, when we're like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Like it's just fascinating. From all of this, your goal in reducing resistance, to roll with the resistance and then ideally kind of resolve it, is to continually move the process of therapy forward with that person. I'm realizing that I want a part 2 of this conversation, because I think there's like so much more. I mean, obviously this is 1 hour. There's so much more to be said here. For you as someone who is very well versed in this way of coding, are you effectively keeping score in your mind where you're like, I am 1 step back, I lost a point, and then this complex reflection that also acknowledged their lived a reality. Oh, that was 4 points. Like, is it like this really interesting football game that's going on in your mind?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's more like the green, yellow, orange, red light that you mentioned earlier, right? Like, I think once you see it, so I've been thinking about expertise for a long time, and this is a way of earning that. But really, the thing I've been interested in for the past decade is expertise. And one of the things in some of the expertise stuff that I've read is that when you're in the moment, you're not always cognitively thinking about it. You're more picking up on it somatically. And so for me, it's more of a red, green, yellow thing than like +1, -1. Now, when I watch tape, and I do watch tape regularly, right, because of this idea of deliberate practice, then I am going through and I'm doing much more of a 1, gold star, X mark, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think once you kind of see it, it's hard to unsee it. And so it doesn't have to be so analytical and detached, but it is there in the background.
I think that's one of the things that stands out to me about these almost like spirit of therapy concepts that come from a lot of different models, but they change the way potentially that you operate in the room therapeutically. And they are manualized. And like you said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Then I think it becomes a spirit and a way of being. And it's always so interesting to me to talk to folks who are like diehard in MI or diehard in FIT, because there is just really kind of like a way of carrying yourself in the world, and not just, I think, in therapy. It's really interesting to me. But I like that concept because then it doesn't feel as scary, because I remember in my first internship learning a new manualized method. I'm not going to say the acronym just out of respect for the method. But, my agency spent me to like a week-long training, like 8 hours a day for 5 days. And then I walked away with this like 1,000-page book. And it's like, well, when this happens, then this happens, and then you. And then you go to page 46. And then 40 is like, pick your own adventure. But it's like, how am I supposed to do this while I'm in therapy with somebody? And I think some of the beauty of what we're talking about today is like, yes, there is this manualized process and the true coding, quote unquote. But really, what we're talking about is the spirit of careful and natural, nuanced moves in relationship to somebody else in this dance. And that it, at first glance, is very complicated. But at least my experience was that, like, once I kind of got over the complication and really started to think about the implications, then it was a total paradigm shift for me. And I think that's probably kind of why you're here today, Jordan, is like that concept of like kind of the stance of what is healing, what is therapy, what is motivation, what is resistance, and how are we interpreting that to either drive the process forward or to let it stay stagnant or even, unfortunately, drive it back.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head.
I want to keep talking and we're out of time. For our listeners who want to specifically learn more about you, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to do that is to reach out to me at jordanthecounselor.com. That's my website where I write about everything that I'm learning about helping therapists to help more people and helping therapists to make more money, right? So we talk about businesses and how you build a better practice, and then also clinical work. How do you do that? So, and for me, this is both of those things, right? Like in the research and also as a business owner, one of the big metrics is retention, right? And so how we respond to moments of resistance impacts retention. So that's the business side. And then as a therapist, clinical side, I mean, we all know how we feel when someone really hears us, or when we go to the doctor and we're like, you don't really get it. So on the clinical side, it also is really important as well. So jordanthecounselor.com is where I publish. I publish at least once a week. Fridays is AI Fridays to talk about AI and counseling because that is happening. And then Mondays I will publish what I'm learning about clients and therapy and different coding stuff. So.
And for resources, like what are your favorite websites, periodicals, books where you're like, oh, this is the juicy stuff?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, I think the first thing is, if for people who don't know this, right, go back and listen to Scott Miller and Dale Shaw. And they got a book that I love called Better Results. I mean, pick up a copy of the book. It's just phenomenal. Yeah, it's a great book. If you want to read the research, I would pick up the article I mentioned earlier, right? Developing expertise in psychotherapy, the case for process coding as clinical training. Start there, read that article. It's a really great one. And then Haney Westra, who's now retired, and Alyssa's not doc program, so she's finishing up. They have a bunch of other articles that you can definitely dive into. Therapist responsivity during disagreement in psychotherapy is a great one. It's from 2022. There's another one, the resistance vignette task, validating a rapid measure of therapist skill at managing resistance is another great article. So any of those would be great places to start on the academic side. And then, I mean, there's a bunch of articles on my site that are less academic, but maybe more user-friendly that you can check out as well.
Thank you. Again, for our listeners, Dr. Jordan Harris coming on talking to us today about process coding, about resistance, and kind of some options forward. I know that I will have a little invisible to them light hovering over my clients' heads, and that'll stay with me. Thank you. I think this gives us all a lot to think about, and I also think gives a lot of direction and clarity, because sometimes it can get so damn complicated. And I appreciate that some of these models can actually just kind of overlay and they become pan-theoretical and are just in the business of making us better. So thank you. It's been wonderful to talk with you, Jordan. I am so glad that you came.
Thank you. And I can only echo what you said. I think if I can make one slight highlight of what you just said, right, is, I mean, part of the idea is that a lot of these ideas come from MI, but that really, in my eyes, is really good, not necessarily at like being in therapy, but being at a way to see process of motivation. And I really agree with you. And to me, that's what's so exciting about this is that it's pan-theoretical. And so you can totally do whatever model is that you already do, right? We're just making sure that the dough is warm and the cookies are the right size.
Well, I'm going to grab a cookie. Thank you so much for joining us, Jordan. It's been lovely to have you.
Thank you again.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.